So the heroin trade, well, I always like to say that heroin is simultaneously destroying Afghanistan and keeping millions of people there alive. It's become an essential aspect of financing for the insurgency, for certain other power brokers, warlords, corrupt officials who may see a benefit to the conflict continuing, because obviously in stable places tend to have a huge drug trade. So in my opinion, the drug trade in effect perpetuates the conflict, but also helps to finance the conflict and finance some very important conflict elites on both sides of the conflict. So it has been incredibly destabilizing. At the same time, millions of Afghans depend on farming poppy or transporting it or some aspect of the trade just to survive. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword at this point. Unfortunately, not much has changed, except the country's become more violent. There seem to be more civilian casualties than ever, and addiction is more widespread than ever. The government, the government of President Ashraf Ghani has arguably been somewhat of an improvement over President Hamid Karzai, whose regime was extraordinarily corrupt. But the drug trade is still a major percentage of GDP in Afghanistan. No country has ever been as economically dependent on drugs as Afghanistan. Even Colombia, at the height of the cocaine trade, never came close to the amount of economic dependency that Afghanistan has on drugs. The country essentially has no other exports except for carpets, and that's a very small sector. And so it's it's a country that is highly dependent on this illegal economy, and there has been very little effective investment from the international community. There's been a lot of investment, very little of it has been effective in reducing the trade. And this is not an issue I work on full time anymore, but I do check in from time to time, and I'm always dismayed to see that the drug trade in Afghanistan seems to be as strong as it was 10 years ago when my book came out. I tracked the Taliban from their very, very early days. I was a reporter in Afghanistan in the 90s when the Taliban were in power, so I had experience with them, interviewing officials. It was actually one of the very first stories I did as a young reporter way back in 1996 was on the Taliban's role in the heroin trade, in the opium trade, and how they were taxing poppy farmers and not trying to prevent the trade. I went back as I was researching the book and looked up old cables, old reporting about the origins of the Taliban. I tracked down the founders of the Taliban, many of whom were, or the financiers of the original leadership of the Taliban were all drug producers. Two of them are in jail in the United States today on life sentences for trafficking heroin. So drug traders had played a role in establishing and supporting the Taliban from their very, very earliest days. The Taliban government was always pro-poppy. There was a year when they banned farmers from growing poppy, and one of the main counter-arguments I've heard by those who claim that my argument is wrong is that the Taliban was the only government in Afghanistan that ever effectively imposed a ban on farmers growing poppy, and that ban only lasted for 1 year. It's arguable if they would have been able to implement it a second year, or if they would have even wanted to, because 9/11 happened and they were knocked out of power. But the evidence that I found was that the Taliban actually profited on that. There was such a glut of poppy the year before the ban that they stood to get hundreds of millions of dollars in international aid, as well as they were sitting on these huge stockpiles of poppy, tons and tons and tons of poppy that was going to rot. And so the prices for their product went through the roof. And so the leadership of the Taliban and the drug traffickers they were in cahoots with ended up profiting wildly. And it was, as usual, poor Afghan farmers and sharecroppers who suffered from it. But it had a negligible impact on the global supply of heroin, that ban, because there was so much stockpiled. It just made it more expensive. The Taliban, there's many different Talibans, and there's many different factions of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and there's different factions of the Taliban in Pakistan. So it's hard to paint them all with one brush. Some factions of the Taliban are much more criminalized than others and always have been. Some factions of the Taliban were really more pious and devoted to helping people and protecting communities from the very start. And to the extent that they began to engage in criminal activity or taxing illicit activity like the drug trade, they did so more reluctantly and more slowly, and with less and were less violent or less predacious towards the communities where they operated. What we have today are multiple commanders and multiple factions that predate and really terrorize the local communities where they operate. And taxing the drug trade is just one of the many criminal activities they engage in. There are extortion rackets, there are kidnapping schemes, there's illegal mining, all sorts of smuggling and taxing, gray and black market smuggling that goes on in those regions. So they really today operate much more like a mafia, but to some extent, some of the commanders always have, others less so, but it's important also to put the way that Taliban behave in more of a global perspective. Any insurgent organization, by virtue of fighting against the state, has to operate in black markets. And so one of the things we see, a trend that I began learning about as I studied the Taliban in comparative studies that I did, is that regardless of the epoch of history, the ethnic group, the place in the world, the religious affiliation, insurgent groups have always engaged in black market activities to raise money. And a good example of this is the American Revolution. The American revolutionaries depended on the smuggling of tobacco and molasses when they were fighting against Great Britain to throw the British out of the American colonies. And the premier Boston smuggler was actually the most famous signatory to our Declaration of Independence, John Hancock. So you find this trend in many, if not most conflicts. Unless an insurgency is funded by another state. So during the Cold War, often the Soviets would fund an insurgency that was aimed at ousting a U.S.-backed government, or the U.S. would fund an insurgency, et cetera, et cetera. Now that practice has more or less gone away in the world, it still exists in some places, but increasingly you'll see insurgent and terror groups aiming to gain independence, even if they do have some state backing, by engaging in organized crime activities. And so this is not something that's limited to the Taliban. We see it with ISIS, we see it with the FARC in Colombia, we've seen it with the Tamil Tigers, the IRA. It's literally, it's a very common phenomenon. There were a number of incentives, I guess, for the U.S. government incentives or reasons for the U.S. government to behave the way it did towards corruption in Afghanistan. One issue that I think has been very damaging is this kind of mindset among many Western officials, not just Americans, that Afghanistan is an inherently corrupt place and that paying bribes and accepting corruption is just the price of doing business in a place like Afghanistan. You see the same attitude in places like Latin America and Africa, and I think it's a pernicious and unfortunate attitude that doesn't take into account my experience on the ground in those places, which is that ordinary people, I mean, there is a lot of corruption, to be sure, but ordinary people loathe it. It's not a part of their culture. They wish it would go away. Their lives are chewed up by it, quite literally. And I do think that Western governments or donor nations need to make anti-corruption and accountability a central part of any development project or program that they're running, not just in Afghanistan, but certainly there. Afghanistan, if anything, is the poster child of how foreign aid goes wrong if accountability isn't taken into account from the very early point of planning. I think the other issue that led to that attitude, I guess, among American officials was this urgency to get things done, and this approach, again, a very quintessential sort of foreign policy approach among the American that you hear over and over again in American foreign policy, which is sort of like, he's an SOB, but he's our SOB. You know, we might not like the way the Karzai family, the businesses that, but at least they're working for us and not against us. Again, I think that that's a self-defeating attitude. If your partners are behaving in a way locally that loses public support, and if they are behaving violently and in a corrupt fashion towards the local populace, you're going to have a failed mission over time. And it's a self-defeating approach to get in bed with criminal and corrupt actors. Both President Karzai and his brother Ahmed Wali had been assets of the CIA for years, and I think that the CIA has traditionally been an organization with a sort of short-term mindset of achieving its objectives without thinking of the wider implications it can have for either the country that they're operating in or even the wider world down the line. I mean, you have to remember that the CIA ran the covert war into Afghanistan in the 1980s that eventually led to the toppling of the Soviet-backed government, which then led to the internecine fighting between the various Mujahideen factions. And when that all fell apart, or when that became incredibly violent, then the Taliban emerged and Al-Qaeda then took hold there. And before you knew it, 9/11 happened and we all get sucked back in. So it would be hard for anybody way back in the 1980s when the U.S. government was covertly supporting the Afghan Mujahideen to anticipate all of those eventualities, but they certainly could have had some forethought or foresight about the risk of arming and equipping and training these violent extremists to fight against the Soviet Union. That once they got done fighting the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, they might turn their guns elsewhere. So I think that it was just there's a history of irresponsible foreign policy, excuse me, on the part of the U.S. government in terms of supporting people that they know to be violent or extremist or involved in criminality because it serves some short-term goal. And I think ultimately that's a self-defeating approach. There's multiple American positions, and I think many of the in fact, I would say most of the Americans that I encountered out there, folks in government and diplomacy and even in the intelligence world, were well-intentioned. They wanted to leave Afghanistan better than they found it. But there was also tremendous pressure to show results. And so there was a short-termism for people, for a lot of people in positions of importance, that they had 9 months or 1 year to turn things around. Afghanistan is an incredibly complex place with all sorts of tribal, ethnic, and geopolitical and regional rivalries that are, it's a very steep learning curve to get your head around what's going on there. And I think that one of the issues is there was a lot of rotation of people, through the embassies, through the military command, through the intelligence services. And so you had a lot of people who were inexperienced in the region and inexperienced operating globally in environments like that came in and thought they had found a solution, but really it was just a short-term one that really didn't take some of the longer-term issues into consideration. And I guess what I find discouraging is that my experience living in both Afghanistan and Pakistan is that, like here in the United States, most people I encounter are moderate. They're religious moderates, they're political moderates. They don't want an extreme. They don't want an extreme regime. They don't want to live in they might be deeply religious, but they don't want. They want safety. They want education. They want healthcare, just like all of us. And I don't understand why our diplomatic efforts and our political a lot of our aid and funding has gone to some of the most extreme elements, as opposed to really bolstering the power of those moderate forces, moderate political groups, technocrats, the boring stuff, to get the sewage systems working again, to get the roads built. And it just, it feels like a huge amount of money was spent. There was an enormous cost in human lives as well, both Afghans and foreigners. And the only thing we needed to do was to help establish the emergence of a state regime that was just slightly better than the Taliban. Even if it had just, people would have gravitated to it. And we couldn't even do that. That's pathetic. The Taliban has got to be one of the worst governments in the history of the planet, the history of humanity. And the fact that we couldn't pull that off I think is a real stain on not just American foreign policy, but sort of NATO cooperation in general. I haven't looked into the numbers recently, but it's a multi-billion-dollar trade at the global level. I believe it's, the last time I checked with the UNODC, it was believed to be between $5 and $7 billion globally. It could be higher than that. It's certainly the largest percentage of Afghanistan's GDP. The vast majority of the profits from Afghanistan's drug trade are earned outside of Afghanistan. The most lucrative aspects of it come from selling the processed drugs. So most of the money leaves the country, and but many people who look into the drug trade in Afghanistan focus almost exclusively on the farmers and the farm level value of the crops, which is probably worth, I don't know at this point, but several hundreds of millions of dollars that accrue to farmers in Afghanistan. Many of them are poor sharecroppers who earn a few $100s a year if they're lucky. You have some larger family farms and larger, more industrial farms owned by traffickers that will be making a lot more money than that. Then you have the labs where it is processed. Traditionally, Afghanistan didn't have the capacity, labs with the capacity to process it beyond cooking down the raw poppy into what's known as morphine base, which is a precursor to heroin. Increasingly, there are labs within Afghan territory. Traditionally, those labs that could do more sophisticated work were in Iran or in Turkey or in Pakistan. In the last decade, some of them have shifted into Afghanistan. And so now you do have actors within Afghanistan that have the capacity to produce the high-level white crystal that's known as heroin. I'm not sure how much the synthetic opioid market has impacted demand for Afghanistan's opiates in recent years. There's certainly, it's certainly true that the vast majority of the crop that's produced there is consumed regionally in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran and in Russia and Central Asia. The vast majority of it stays there. Some of it goes to Europe, some of it comes to Canada and the US, but the vast majority of it stays in the region. You know, it's not only getting very little airtime, it's getting very little intelligence support. I have been proposing for years. I mean, I had the interesting experience after writing my book of being sucked into working for the Defense Department. I kind of recruited to come and help them. And I realized at the time how little our intelligence community and the defense community understood about how the Taliban was engaging in the drug trade. They had this very superficial view that the Taliban were taxing farmers, and that was about it. There was very little understanding beyond that by the vast majority of folks, even those focused on understanding Taliban financing. And so I did work with them for several years in the intelligence community. It was a really interesting experience for me. But I was astounded to find that no one had ever looked beyond Afghanistan's borders. And I was invited, and I lasted there for a couple of years, and then I couldn't take it anymore. And so I left and went on to doing other things, and was invited back to speak with the director of national intelligence team just a couple of years ago, and found to my complete amazement that 10 years later, still that study hadn't been done. Still no one had tracked where the Taliban's money goes. There's this perception, and there always has been, that the Taliban are these pious village idiots living in caves, and that if they make any money, you know, it's stored under the mattress in Kandahar somewhere. In fact, what analysis I did and what analysis a few others did shows that, you know, there are vast flows of money that go mainly into the UAE, places like Turkey, into Europe, and the money from the drug trade in Afghanistan is laundered globally largely through what are known as trade-based money laundering regimes, where traders or money launderers will buy physical goods with drug money once it's sold, say cars or electronics equipment, and then those will get shipped back to the drug trafficker closer to the region, and they'll get sold, and then that person will be able to, they will have an excuse for their wealth because there will be an importer of Land Cruisers or an importer of tires, and so that's what we see in Afghanistan. These very, very wealthy traders, like some of the ones that were eventually apprehended, Haji Juma Khan, Haji Bashar Norzai, Haji Baz Mohammed. Those guys were all major vehicle and electronics importers to Afghanistan. It was all, and they were all huge money laundering operations. So the money's all over the place. It's in real estate, it's in banks, it's in these big businesses that they run. It's all over the place, except it's not in Afghanistan. And many of these big drug traffickers live in either the UAE or they live in Pakistan. They live in, you know, huge mansions. They drive around in Land Cruisers, and they send their kids to private schools. So they live very sophisticated lives, far, far, far from the grime of Afghanistan's poppy fields. I think it's part willful ignorance, and I think it's part just the issue of turnover within the intelligence and law enforcement community. Now and then you come across somebody who really understands how to follow the money, and they get really interested in this, and they start poking around, and they make some really interesting findings, but it's not comprehensive. There has also been, since the days of the Obama administration and continuing into the Trump administration, there has been an objective to reach some kind of settlement with the Taliban. And the US government by law is prevented from doing settlements with convicted drug traffickers. And so if they come to the conclusion sort of community-wide that the Taliban as an organization is devoted to drug trafficking, make a peace deal that much harder to get through Congress. I mean, it's sort of ridiculous. It's like the bright shining lie. I mean, everybody knows they're moving billions of dollars worth of heroin. So how they I mean, for me, it's difficult to understand why we should be reaching a settlement with an organization that doesn't let girls go to school or women have medical treatment. So that alone should disqualify them from a peace settlement, unless at the very least they can really genuinely demonstrate that they have rejected those policies, which they've never done. But on top of that, to be an organization that is known to be moving billions of dollars worth of drugs at a time when just here in this country, we're losing 70,000 people a year to opioid overdoses. The notion that we're negotiating for a peace settlement with a group like this is flabbergasting to me. I think that there's so much dirty money sloshing through the global financial system, and there's such a poor understanding of how to counter it, and the folks that are trying to do something about it are so under resourced that it's it's just such a huge problem. I don't think anybody has the resources or the know-how to go after, or the balls, I guess. It's just the globally dirty money is believed to be more than 3 times the U.S. defense budget. So if you think about how you're going to get a project off the ground to track that and stop that from happening, there's never the political will to do anything about it. There's just too much money sloshing around. Do I think there are high-level officials paid off to look the other way? I'm sure there are, but do I think is there some huge conspiracy? I doubt it. I think it's more that there's just so many priorities, and this is such a challenging thing to try and deal with. But the irony is, today, with technology and money transferring through mobile phones and even Bitcoin and things like that, it should make it easier to track this, not harder. It's less easy than it ever was to carry suitcases of cash around the world. So money launderers are having to resort to more and more complex mechanisms to move money. But we really have not applied the resources to track it and stop it that we should be doing. And the other thing really is that, for all the times you've seen a Haji Juma Khan or a Chapo Guzman get flown into the United States and put into jail, how many HSBC or Deutsche Bank executives have ever gone to jail? These banks get fines, and they may be multi-billion-dollar fines, but these banks are so big that those fines represent a rounding error for these companies. And until we start really penalizing financial institutions and putting their executives in jail, I don't think we're going to see a change in the way financial institutions approach this issue. It's very hard for me to imagine a completely peaceful Afghanistan, until the illicit economy is ended there. But I also I'm not sure how to I'm not sure at this point how the illicit economy will ever go away unless there is dramatic reduction in demand. And I anticipate that demand reduction will come not because of any organized, if it happens, I imagine it will happen not because of any organized demand reduction effort, but because some other drug replaces it. Unfortunately, I think that it's unfortunate. I think it's unfortunately there's so many geopolitical and economic and other barriers to the international community coming up with a cohesive plan to help Afghanistan that we've kind of lost the window. The window was there after 2001, but it started going wrong. It continued going wrong, and I don't see it. It certainly doesn't seem to be going in the direction it should be going to stabilize Afghanistan now. In fact, I'm worried Afghanistan will sink further into instability if the current plan to withdraw all foreign troops is carried out. I'm not optimistic that Afghanistan is headed towards a more peaceful era at all. I'm very sad about it, but I think that the Taliban seems to be resurgent and extremely violent. The level of violence that's occurring there daily now is just horrifying, including some of the recent attacks on Kabul University students and other things are just heartbreaking. I think the international community, with the pandemic, with the global economic turmoil, is donor nations are focused more on their own internal problems, and maybe, you never know, that will give Afghanistan the opportunity to sort things out on its own without the rest of the world. But I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to see a peaceful and prosperous Afghanistan emerge anytime in the near future.
Okay,
and I
so
certainly, you asked about the peace deal. I'm not optimistic about the peace deal either, mainly in part because the U.S. government seems to be running for the exits, and that's never a situation where one is bargaining from a position of power. And I think the Taliban are biding their time for the U.S. to pull out. And I think, as has been the case in the past, there are multiple regional actors, including Iran, India, Pakistan, that have all got their Russia, that have all got their fingers in there and are stirring things up and making any hope for a durable settlement unlikely, and or diminishing any hope for a durable settlement. Back when I was first in Afghanistan in the 1990s, the UN ambassador to the region, Lakhdar Brahimi, was proposing what he called a 7+2 formula. I believe it was 7+2, and the idea of it was that in order to get a peaceful settlement in Afghanistan, you needed all of Afghanistan's immediate neighbors had to be part of the settlement, as did the U.S. and China. And I always thought that was the smartest approach, that the road to peace in Afghanistan is going to depend on some kind of settlement between India and Pakistan. It's going to depend on some kind of settlement between the U.S. and Iran, some kind of settlement between the U.S. and Russia, and for China to at least be in agreement in terms of how the region is settled, and to think about all of those conflicts, U.S., Iran, India, Pakistan, all of those huge geopolitical conflicts and rivalries that date back decades as well, coming I mean, poor Afghanistan is sort of the playground where all of those bullies get together and fight out their problems. It's the hot war. It's the hot space for all of those Cold War conflicts. And it's just very hard to see um, how there'll be a solution until all of those other, or at least those other issues are at least partially settled, or at least both sides can agree to get out of Afghanistan's way and let them find peace. And I truly hope it happens. Well, I think gender equality or improving the rights of women is a core pillar in any peaceful society. Eventually, women need at least some measure of equality. I think Afghanistan's warring factions could put down their weapons and um, reach some sort of settlement without first achieving full equality of the sexes in Afghanistan. But certainly, the country would benefit enormously from its women having better access to education and healthcare. It would improve conditions for everybody, not just women. And that's a that's not just my opinion. I mean, science and data shows, and that the more you educate women, the more healthcare and various outcomes improve for the entire society. And I think that again, when you see a place as messed up as Afghanistan is on so many fundamental levels, it's just a messed up place. Part of that is because you have one half of the population that is highly illiterate. Huge percentages of women can't read. They're almost completely uneducated. They don't know how to feed their children properly. They don't know basic hygiene. All of this leads to some of the problems and the joblessness and the extremism that emerges from there. And so I do think in Afghanistan, from as a result of the international community pouring money into the region, is that there has been an improvement generally in education, and a lot of girls have gone back to school. The university systems have been resurrected, and some of them have, and there is a generation of young Afghans who have come through with much better opportunities. It's not widespread by any, or it's not universal by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly improvement over where the country was 20 years ago. And I do think those young educated Afghans are going to, hopefully when they take the mantle of that country, they'll be able to turn it around. I guess if I have one hope for Afghanistan, it is that youth bulge. It is those young people. And if we can just get rid of that generation of warlords and drug traffickers, maybe those kids can come in and take over and fix that place up. I certainly hope so. I would love to see Afghanistan be peaceful. It's been at war for too long, and it is a beautiful place full of beautiful people that truly, truly deserves better.